My name is Eleanor. I'm in my late 30s, and for most of my adult life, I've been described with words like steady, reasonable, and low drama. I work in operations, one of those roles where things run smoothly precisely because no one notices you. At home, I was the same. The calm one. The one who remembered birthdays, handled logistics, and smoothed over misunderstandings before they turned into arguments. People often assume that someone like me doesn't feel things deeply, or that if I do, I'll explain them away, quietly. I've learned that being composed can make others underestimate how much you see, how much you remember, and how long you're willing to sit with the truth before speaking it out loud. This story isn't about revenge. It isn't about winning. And it definitely isn't about me standing up one day and suddenly becoming someone loud or unrecognizable. It's about what happens when trust erodes slowly, and when the person you love tells you that your reality is wrong again and again, until you start questioning your own instincts. At the center of this is a sentence I never expected to hear from my spouse. "You're overreacting." He said it after I found evidence of an affair, not rumors, not intuition, evidence. And somehow, in that moment, the accusation wasn't the betrayal that hurt the most. It was what came after. The explanations that twisted timelines. The calm insistence that I was imagining patterns that weren't there. The suggestion that my hurt said more about my insecurity than his behavior. Gaslighting hurts more than the truth. What you're about to hear is the emotional journey of realizing that clarity doesn't always arrive with fireworks. Sometimes it arrives quietly, when you stop asking to be understood and start observing instead. This is a story about the slow shift from self-doubt to self-trust, from reacting to choosing, from being managed emotionally to reclaiming your own internal authority. I'll walk you through who I was to the people around me, how small dismissals accumulated, and how silence, once something I used to keep the peace, became a deliberate decision. There are no villains here in the theatrical sense, just people acting in ways they thought would never be questioned, and one person who finally questioned everything. I'm sharing this with honesty, not embellishment. Not to dramatize pain, but to document a process many experience and few articulate. The moment you realize you don't need to prove your reality to someone committed to denying it. If you've ever been told you were too sensitive when you were simply paying attention, you may recognize parts of yourself in what follows. And as you listen, I invite you to reflect gently. Have you ever felt the difference between someone disagreeing with you and someone quietly rewriting your reality? To the people around me, I was easy to define. I was the reliable one, the calm spouse, the person who remembered to submit the forms, refill the prescriptions, and answer emails with complete sentences. I wasn't invisible exactly, but I was predictable, and predictability often gets mistaken for permanence. In my marriage, I occupied a role that felt both flattering and diminishing. I was the one who understood. If plans changed at the last minute, I adjusted. If he was stressed, I gave space. If something he said landed wrong, I softened it before it could bruise. Friends used to joke that I was low maintenance. They said it like a compliment. I accepted it like one. At work, it was similar. I was trusted with responsibility, but rarely spotlighted. When something went wrong, I fixed it quietly. When something went right, it was assumed that it would. No one worried about me burning out or becoming unhappy because I never performed unhappiness in a visible way. I didn't complain. I didn't dramatize. I absorbed. That tendency followed me home. In social settings, my spouse was often described as charismatic, driven, intense, in a good way. I was the grounding presence beside him. People said we balanced each other. What they didn't see was how often that balance required me to bend. How often I edited myself mid-sentence because I could feel his impatience before he voiced it. How often my emotional responses were quietly rerouted so the evening could continue smoothly. I don't say this with resentment. At the time, I believed this was maturity. I told myself that not every feeling needed to be expressed, that love sometimes meant choosing peace over being right. I believed restraint was strength, and in many ways it was. But restraint can slowly turn into erasure if no one ever meets you halfway. When I did speak up, rarely, carefully, it was usually framed as a misunderstanding. That's not what I meant. You're reading too much into it. Why are you making this heavier than it needs to be? The tone was never cruel. That's important. It was calm, even affectionate, as if my emotions were an innocent miscalculation that needed correcting. Over time, I learned to pre-correct myself. I'd feel something rise, discomfort, suspicion, disappointment, and I'd immediately ask myself whether it was reasonable, whether I was being fair, whether I was projecting. I became very good at interrogating my own reactions before anyone else had the chance to. From the outside, this looked like emotional intelligence. From the inside, it felt like constant self-surveillance. People trusted me because I didn't make things messy. My spouse trusted that if something was wrong, I'd either handle it alone or decide it wasn't worth mentioning, and I trusted that this mutual quietness meant stability. I didn't yet understand that stability built on silence is fragile. Looking back, I can see how clearly defined my role was. I was the emotional buffer, the one who made life easier for others by asking less of myself. Not because anyone explicitly demanded it, but because the system rewarded me when I stayed within those boundaries. No one told me I was invisible. They just didn't look closely because nothing appeared to be wrong. And I didn't challenge that perception because challenging it would have required admitting to myself first that something was wrong. That being consistently underestimated isn't the same as being at peace. That being valued for your composure can coexist with being dismissed as soon as your composure cracks. At that stage of my life, I still believed that if I remained reasonable enough, clear enough, patient enough, everything important would eventually be acknowledged. I believed that truth, once presented calmly, would always be received. I hadn't yet learned that some people don't misunderstand you. They understand you perfectly and rely on your silence to keep things exactly as they are. The first moment I remember wasn't dramatic. There was no argument, no raised voice, no sudden realization that split my life in two. That's why it stayed with me. It was small enough to dismiss and precise enough to linger. We were sitting at the kitchen counter late one evening, the house quiet in that way that only happens after a long day. He was scrolling through his phone, half listening as I talked about something minor, an upcoming work project, a deadline that had shifted. I remember pausing mid-sentence because I noticed the absence of eye contact. Not unusual, just notable. At some point, I mentioned that I'd be traveling the following month. He nodded without looking up and said, "That's fine, just don't make it complicated." I asked him what he meant. He sighed. Not loudly, not angrily, more like someone inconvenienced by a question that shouldn't have needed asking. "You know what I mean," he said. "You tend to overthink these things." There it was, lightly delivered, almost affectionate, a comment that could easily be brushed aside. I laughed it off in the moment, even added a joke at my own expense. But something about the phrasing stayed with me, not the words themselves, but the ease with which my internal process was reduced to a flaw. Not wrong, not different, just too much. Nothing else happened that night. We finished dinner, we talked about weekend plans, life continued. But later, lying in bed, I replayed the exchange. I tried to understand why it unsettled me. After all, people say careless things sometimes. No one is perfectly attuned. I reminded myself of that. Still, I noticed how quickly the responsibility shifted. I wasn't invited to clarify what I needed. I was simply reminded, gently, that my way of processing was an inconvenience to be managed. In the days that followed, similar moments appeared. Not often, not obviously, but enough to form a pattern if you were paying attention. I'd ask a question and be told I was reading into it. I'd point out a discrepancy in a story and hear, "Why are you looking for problems?" Each time the tone was calm, reasonable, as if I were the variable that needed adjusting. No one else seemed to notice. Friends still commented on how lucky we were to communicate so well. Family praised how balanced we seemed, and I agreed with them, out loud. Internally, though, I began to hesitate before speaking. I started pre-editing my thoughts, trimming away anything that might be labeled excessive or unnecessary. Not because he demanded it, because I didn't want to feel that quiet, sinking sensation again, the sense that my curiosity or concern was being framed as a personal flaw. This is how the first cut works. It doesn't draw blood. It just teaches you where not to touch. I told myself it was normal. Long relationships require compromise. That not every comment deserves weight. And maybe that was true. But something subtle had shifted. I stopped trusting my initial reactions. When you do that long enough, you forget what they sounded like before they were filtered. I remember one afternoon, weeks later, realizing I'd decided not to bring something up because I could already hear his response in my head. That realization unsettled me more than the issue itself. I wasn't responding anymore. I was predicting and then complying. At the time, I didn't name it. I didn't call it disrespect or minimization. I just felt smaller, quieter, as if a part of me had learned to fold itself away to keep the peace. And the most unsettling part was how reasonable it all seemed. No one was yelling. No boundaries were being explicitly crossed. There was just a steady, almost imperceptible recalibration, where my perceptions were gently downgraded and his version of events became the default. I didn't confront him. I didn't journal about it. I didn't even consciously store it as evidence of anything. But I remembered it, because even the smallest cuts leave a record in the body. And whether we acknowledge them or not, they change how we move through the world. Once the first small cut healed over, it became easier to accept the next one. Not because it hurt less, but because I'd already learned how to explain it away. By then, I had developed a quiet internal script. When something felt off, I didn't ask why. That bothered me. I asked whether it is worth mentioning. Most of the time, the answer was no. Not because it wasn't real, but because I could already anticipate the outcome. A sigh. A look of mild confusion. A calm explanation of how I was misinterpreting things. So I began to normalize it. If he interrupted me mid-thought, I told myself he was excited. If he forgot something important to me, I reminded myself he had a lot on his mind. If he dismissed a concern with a joke, I laughed along, then replayed it later in silence, trying to locate the exact moment my discomfort had been converted into humor. What made it difficult to identify as disrespectful was its packaging. There was no hostility, no cruelty. Everything was delivered with a tone that suggested reason, efficiency, and even care. It wasn't your fault. It was you who were just seeing it differently. And somehow, that felt harder to argue with. Over time, my reactions became more muted. I didn't stop feeling things. I just stopped trusting those feelings as valid data. I became an interpreter of my own experience, constantly translating it into something more palatable before allowing it to surface. I remember a dinner with friends where someone asked how we handle conflict. Before I could answer, he smiled and said, "We don't really fight. Eleanor is very level-headed." Everyone laughed approvingly. I smiled too. But inside, something tightened. Not because the statement was entirely false, but because it was incomplete in a way that erased effort. It framed my silence as temperament, not as labor. On the drive home, I considered mentioning it. I even rehearsed a version that sounded light, non-accusatory. But then I imagined the response. "You're taking that the wrong way. It was a compliment. Why are you looking for an issue where there isn't one?" So I let it go. That became the pattern. Each dismissal trained me to self-correct faster, to swallow responses before they reached my mouth, to become so skilled at de-escalation that I rarely escalated anything at all. The strange thing is, the more I accommodated, the more the dynamic solidified. My quiet became expected. My flexibility became assumed. And when I did express discomfort, it stood out, not as information, but as a disruption. I started to notice how often conversations ended with me nodding. Not because I agreed, but because continuing felt pointless. There's a particular exhaustion that comes from explaining your inner world to someone who treats it like a puzzle they've already solved. At some point, I stopped trying to be understood and focused, instead on being reasonable. Reasonable meant calm. Reasonable meant not insisting. Reasonable meant accepting alternative explanations for things that didn't sit right. And every time I chose reasonable over honest, I moved one step further away from myself. I didn't frame this as a sacrifice at the time. I framed it as maturity. as emotional intelligence, as the kind of partner who doesn't create unnecessary friction. But friction is sometimes what tells you something is misaligned. What I didn't realize then was how dangerous it is to normalize being subtly diminished. When you accept small invalidations repeatedly, they accumulate into a worldview where your perceptions are always provisional, subject to approval, revision, or dismissal by someone else. And because nothing catastrophic had happened yet, I told myself there was nothing to address. No affair, no betrayal, no clear wrongdoing, just a growing sense that I was constantly adjusting my internal compass to match his. I thought this was what compromise looked like. It took me a long time to understand that compromise requires two people moving. What we had was only one of us bending, and the other one calling it balance. By then, the disrespect no longer felt like an event. It felt like an atmosphere, something I breathed in daily, unnoticed, until the absence of it became unimaginable. And still, I stayed quiet, because when something becomes normal, questioning it feels like an overreaction. And I had been taught carefully, consistently, that overreacting was the one thing I must never do. There's a moment, quiet, almost clinical, when you realize you've been cast in a role you never auditioned for. Not because someone announced it, but because every interaction begins to reinforce the same expectation. I was the stable one, the capable one, the person who didn't need much. That role followed me everywhere. In conversations, I was the listener. In decisions, I was the one who adjusted. In moments of tension, I was expected to smooth things over, not because I was explicitly told to, but because things went better for everyone when I did. Over time, that expectation hardened into something unspoken but firm. My emotional range was meant to stay within certain boundaries. Calm was acceptable. Thoughtful was acceptable. But anything that suggested hurt, confusion, or challenge was quietly redirected. If I expressed disappointment, it was reframed as stress. If I asked for reassurance, it was interpreted as insecurity. If I questioned a story or a change in behavior, it was positioned as distrust. The message was consistent. My role was to understand, not to interrogate. What made it difficult to push against was how useful I was in that position. I kept things functioning. I remembered details others forgot. I anticipated needs before they were voiced. That competence became part of the justification. "You're good at this," the dynamic seemed to say. "Why would you want to be anything else?" I began to notice how rarely my needs were proactively considered, not maliciously, just absent-mindedly. Plans were made assuming I'd be flexible. Emotional labor was distributed, assuming I'd carry more of it. And when I did express a need, it felt like I was disrupting an efficient system. So I learned to need less. I told myself I didn't require much reassurance, that I preferred independence, that I was fine handling things internally. And in a way, I was. I'd always been self-sufficient. But self-sufficiency can be quietly exploited when it becomes the default expectation rather than a choice. The most unsettling part was how natural it all felt. There was no moment where I thought, this is unfair. Instead, I thought, this is just how relationships evolve. I believed that long-term partnerships required one person to be more emotionally adaptive than the other. What I didn't consider was whether that adaptation was mutual. I started noticing how surprised people seemed when I did assert myself. A slight pause, a recalibration, as if they had momentarily forgotten that I was capable of saying no. That reaction told me more than any argument ever could. It meant my compliance had become part of my identity, not just to my spouse, but to everyone around us. I was reliable in a way that made my boundaries feel optional. And once a boundary is treated as optional, crossing it doesn't feel like a violation. It feels like efficiency. I don't think my spouse sat down one day and decided I would be the invisible one. I think he simply adjusted to the space I consistently gave him and stopped checking whether I still wanted to give it. And I didn't check either, because acknowledging the role I'd been assigned would have meant confronting how long I'd played it, how often I'd prioritized being easy over being honest, how much of myself I'd edited it out to remain agreeable. That realization didn't make me angry. It made me still. I began to see myself from the outside, not as I felt, but as I functioned within the system. I was the emotional infrastructure. Necessary, but rarely acknowledged. Expected to hold weight without drawing attention to the strain. Once you see that clearly, you can't unsee it. And that's when something subtle began to shift. Not in my behavior yet, but in my awareness. I stopped assuming that the role I played was the only one available to me. I didn't announce this. I didn't challenge anyone. I simply noticed. And sometimes, noticing is the first quiet act of reclaiming yourself. The shift didn't happen during an argument. There was no confrontation, no raised voices, no moment where everything spilled out at once. It happened on an ordinary afternoon, in the middle of something forgettable. I was folding laundry. That detail matters because nothing about the task demanded my full attention. My hands were busy, my mind was free, and for once I wasn't anticipating anyone else's needs. I was just moving through the rhythm of something familiar. My phone was on the counter. A notification lit up the screen. Nothing unusual. A message preview from a name I didn't recognize. I didn't feel panic. That came later. At first, I felt curiosity. Mild, almost detached. I told myself it was probably work-related, or a group chat, or a wrong number. I picked up the phone and opened the message. It wasn't explicit. That's important. No declarations, no obvious lines crossed, just familiarity where it didn't belong. An inside reference. A tone that assumed context I wasn't part of. I stood there for a long moment, holding a half-folded shirt, reading it again and again. This is where I expected denial to kick in, where I expected my mind to start offering explanations. It's nothing. You don't know the full story. You're overreacting. But none of that happened. Instead, something inside me went very quiet. I didn't feel shocked. I didn't feel rage. I felt alignment, as if a set of scattered impressions, tiny moments, half-noticed dismissals, subtle inconsistencies, suddenly snapped into place. It wasn't that this message proved everything. It was what made everything else make sense. I didn't confront him. Not that day. I didn't even mention it. I placed the phone back on the counter and finished folding the laundry. Every movement felt deliberate, almost ceremonial. That evening, I watched him the way you watch a scene you've already seen once before. The gestures were the same. The tone was the same. But my interpretation had changed. When he told a story, I noticed what he left out. When he laughed at something on his phone, I noticed how quickly he turned the screen away. When he asked about my day, I noticed how efficiently the question was asked, and how little he lingered on the answer. None of this was new. What was new was that I stopped explaining it away. That night, lying in bed, I didn't replay the message obsessively. I didn't imagine confrontations. I didn't cry. I asked myself one question. What do I know for certain? I knew that something had been hidden. I knew that my discomfort over the past months hadn't been irrational. I knew that the calm explanations I'd accepted had required me to doubt my own perception. And I knew, quietly, clearly, that I was done doing that. The shift wasn't about discovering betrayal. It was about reclaiming trust in myself. I realized how much energy I'd spent trying to be fair, balanced, understanding, to the point where I'd extended more grace to someone else's behavior than to my own intuition. That afternoon, standing alone in the kitchen, I made a decision without ceremony. I would stop trying to be convinced. I didn't need the full truth yet. I didn't need a confession. I didn't need validation from anyone else. I just needed to stop disqualifying my own observations. From that moment on, my silence changed. Before, it had been reflexive, an avoidance of conflict. Now, it has become intentional. A pause, a space. I didn't withdraw affection. I didn't act cold. I simply stopped volunteering explanations for my feelings before anyone questioned them. And that small internal adjustment changed everything. I began to listen differently, not for reassurance, but for information. I began to observe patterns without rushing to interpret them generously. I let things land without smoothing them over. No one noticed the shift immediately. From the outside, nothing had changed. I was still calm, still reasonable, still doing the laundry. But inside, I had crossed a threshold. I wasn't angry. I was awake. After that afternoon, my silence was no longer automatic. It wasn't the result of uncertainty or fear of conflict. It was a decision I made again and again, deliberately. This is where many people expect a turning point to look dramatic. They imagine a confrontation, a demand for answers, a visible change in behavior. But what happened instead was quieter and far more revealing. I stopped correcting him when his stories shifted slightly. I stopped filling in gaps. I stopped offering emotional context to soften his words. Not out of spite, but out of curiosity. I wanted to see what remained if I didn't manage the narrative for him. At first, nothing seemed different. He continued as usual, confident, comfortable, unconcerned. My quiet was interpreted the same way it always had been: agreement, acceptance, ease. That told me everything I needed to know. If my silence could be mistaken for consent so easily, then my voice had never been as central as I'd believed. I began to notice how often he spoke without checking whether I was still following, how decisions were framed as updates rather than discussions, how explanations were offered not to invite dialogue, but to close it. And I listened, not with suspicion, but with precision. I paid attention to timelines, to name someone casually and then never again. How often his phone was face down now, to the way he positioned himself in rooms, physically angling away while still speaking to me. I didn't ask questions, I didn't accuse, I didn't even hint, because I was no longer trying to resolve anything emotionally. I was trying to understand it structurally. There's a difference. Emotionally, I had spent months circling the same confusion, hoping clarity would arrive if I explained myself well enough. Structurally, I began to see patterns that didn't require interpretation, only acknowledgement. And the more I observed, the calmer I became. That calmness was misunderstood. He started to comment on it. "You've been quiet lately." Not concerned, just curious, as if noticing a change in the weather. I smiled and said I'd been tired. That was true, but not in the way he assumed. I was tired of narrating my inner world for someone who had already decided how to hear it. I was tired of managing reactions, tired of proving I was reasonable before being allowed to be hurt. Silence, in this context, became a form of containment. I was holding my observations inside, not because I was unsure, but because I was waiting to see how much space he would take if I stopped making myself smaller. The answer was more. Without my usual interjections, his version of events expanded unchecked. He spoke with increasing certainty. Assumptions were stated as facts. Plans were made with confidence, and I took note of all of it. This wasn't manipulation, it was exposure. When you stop intervening, people reveal how they operate when unchallenged. And what I saw wasn't chaos. It was entitlement, subtle, unexamined, normalized. There was a moment, small, almost comical, when he said something that directly contradicted what he'd told me the week before. He didn't realize it. He looked at me, waiting for my usual correction. I said nothing. He paused briefly, then continued. That pause told me he was aware of the role I'd always played, and that my absence from it unsettled him, just slightly. From the outside, it still looked like nothing. We shared meals, we discussed logistics, we existed side by side without visible tension. But inside, I was gathering clarity. Silence had stopped being something done to me. It had become something I used, not to punish, not to manipulate, but to see the truth without interruption. And the truth, once seen clearly, no longer requires an argument to validate it. What they never noticed was how observant I'd always been. People often confuse quiet with inattentive. They assume that because you're not reacting loudly, you're not registering what's happening. In my case, the opposite was true. Silence sharpened my focus. As I stepped back emotionally, my attention widened. I began to see the full architecture of our life together, the routines, the assumptions, the invisible scaffolding that held everything in place. And I realized how much of it relied on me functioning without question. I didn't start preparing in a dramatic sense. There was no checklist titled escape plan. I simply began to stop outsourcing my understanding. I reviewed finances, not because I suspected wrongdoing, but because I wanted clarity. I looked at account patterns, recurring expenses, and subtle shifts in spending that had once seemed insignificant. I wasn't hunting for proof. I was orienting myself. I organized documents I'd let accumulate over the years. Tax returns, insurance policies, contracts. Things I'd always managed in the background, now brought deliberately into the foreground of my awareness. At the same time, I paid attention to language. The way he described time, the way future plans were framed, was vague. The way certain names appeared and disappeared from conversation. None of it was overtly alarming, but together it formed a consistent picture. What struck me most was how little effort he made to obscure anything. Not because there was nothing to hide, but because he assumed there was no one watching closely. That assumption was my leverage. I didn't change my routines. I didn't become secretive. I remained exactly as I had always been, competent, calm, unthreatening. That consistency allowed me to see everything without interference. I also started learning, not about him, but about myself, about what I would need if things changed, about legal structures, about options, quiet research done in the margins of everyday life. I didn't confide in friends, not because I felt ashamed, but because I wasn't ready for opinions. I needed clarity before narrative, facts before interpretation. There is a particular strength in gathering information without rushing to act on it. It requires patience, and patience had always been my underestimated skill. What no one noticed was how my questions had shifted. I no longer asked why in an emotional sense. I asked how and when. I listened for specifics instead of reassurances. And because I wasn't challenging him, he grew more comfortable, less careful. The tone of explanations became casual. Assumptions were voiced openly. I let him talk, not because I believed him, but because I trusted my ability to remember. I documented things privately. Dates, statements, contradictions. Not obsessively, methodically. The same way I'd always handled complex systems at work. Calm, organized, detached. This wasn't about catching him. It was about anchoring myself in reality. The more I did this, the more something unexpected happened. My anxiety faded. Uncertainty had been exhausting. Clarity, even when it pointed toward loss, was stabilizing. I stopped waking up with that vague sense of unease I'd carried for months. I stopped second-guessing my reactions. I wasn't imagining things anymore, I was observing them. There's a misconception that preparation requires aggression, that it's driven by anger or fear. For me, it was driven by alignment. My internal sense of truth had finally caught up with my external behavior. I wasn't waiting for permission to trust myself, and still, no one noticed. To everyone else, I was the same Eleanor. Dependable, reasonable, unchanged. That invisibility, once a liability, became my shield. I moved carefully, not because I was afraid, but because I respected the weight of what I was learning. I understood that once certain thresholds are crossed, you can't return to not knowing. So I waited, not passively, but with intention, because the most consequential shifts don't announce themselves. They happen quietly, while everyone else assumes the system is stable. And by the time instability becomes visible, the groundwork has already been laid. The moment of confirmation didn't arrive with shock. It arrived with stillness. By then, I had stopped needing things to be dramatic in order to be real. I wasn't looking for a message that would change everything. I was looking for coherence. Something that aligned the last few months into a single, undeniable shape. It came one evening when he was in the shower. His phone was on the nightstand, not locked. That detail alone wasn't new. What was new was my relationship to it. I didn't feel tempted. I felt permitted by myself. I didn't rush. I didn't scroll aimlessly. I opened one conversation. The name matched a pattern I'd already noticed. Familiar enough to be casual, obscure enough to avoid attention. What I saw wasn't explicit. Again, that matters. No declarations, no photos, just continuity, frequency, emotional shorthand, references to shared experiences I wasn't part of. It was enough to confirm that this wasn't a misinterpretation, enough to know that my earlier doubts had been inconvenient truths, not overreactions, enough to understand that the narrative I'd been offered about stress, miscommunication, timing, had required my confusion to remain intact. I closed the phone and placed it back exactly where it had been. There was no adrenaline, no urge to confront him, dripping wet from the shower. No desire to scream or cry. What I felt instead was a kind of clarity that bordered on relief. The worst part had already happened, and it wasn't the affair. It was the months of being told indirectly and directly that my perception couldn't be trusted. Gaslighting hurts more than the truth because it fractures your relationship with yourself. Truth, even when painful, restores it. Standing there in the quiet bedroom, I didn't think about what I would say. I thought about what I would no longer do. I would no longer explain away inconsistencies for the sake of harmony. I would no longer carry emotional weight that wasn't mine. I would no longer ask for honesty from someone invested in avoiding it. This wasn't empowerment in the cinematic sense. It was acceptance, a calm understanding of what was, and what wasn't, possible. I sat down on the edge of the bed and waited for him to finish showering. Not because I planned to confront him, but because I wanted to observe myself in this new reality. When he came out wrapped in a towel, he talked about something mundane. I listened. I noticed how easily the words flowed, how practiced the normalcy was, and I felt no urge to interrupt it. That's how I knew something fundamental had shifted. When you stop trying to extract truth from someone, you stop giving them power over your sense of reality. I no longer needed him to admit anything in order for it to be true. The reveal was private because it needed to be. This clarity wasn't something I was ready to share. It was something I needed to integrate. I didn't sleep much that night, but not because I was spiraling. I was recalibrating. I was considering timelines, not emotions, consequences, not confrontations. I thought about the life I'd built, the role I'd played, the assumptions others had made about my tolerance. And for the first time, I didn't feel obligated to protect any of it. By morning, I wasn't angry. I wasn't devastated. I was resolved. Resolution doesn't announce itself loudly. It settles in quietly, like a decision you didn't know you'd already made. I went about the day as usual. Coffee, emails, routine, and underneath it all, a steady understanding. This knowledge belonged to me, and I would decide how and when it mattered. There was no celebration in that moment, no sense of victory, only a clear-eyed awareness of leverage, not as a weapon, but as information. And information, once seen clearly, changes the shape of every choice that follows. Knowing something and deciding what to do with it are two very different experiences. After the private reveal, I didn't rush toward action. I sat with the knowledge, letting it settle into my understanding of the past, the present, and the future. I didn't ask myself what I should do. I asked what each possible path would cost me. There were options. I could confront him immediately, present what I'd seen, and demand explanations. That would have been emotionally satisfying in the short term. It also would have handed him the advantage, time to reframe, to minimize, to redirect the conversation toward my reaction rather than his behavior. I could pretend nothing had happened and continue as before. That would preserve stability on the surface, but at the cost of my internal alignment. I knew now that returning to unknowing wasn't possible. I could also leave without explanation. That idea crossed my mind briefly, not as an impulse, but as a theoretical option. But I understood the implications. Abrupt exits create chaos. Chaos favors the unprepared. The decision point wasn't about morality. It was about coherence. I asked myself a different question. What choice allows me to remain steady, clear, and intact, regardless of how he responds? The answer surprised me with its simplicity. I chose irreversibility, not in the sense of final action, but in the sense of internal commitment. I decided that whatever came next, I would not negotiate with denial. I would not debate my reality. I would not accept emotional explanations that contradicted observable behavior. That decision closed several doors quietly and permanently. From that point on, my actions were guided by one principle. I would move in ways that did not require his understanding in order to be valid. This ruled out dramatic confrontations. It ruled out emotional appeals. It ruled out any approach that placed my clarity at the mercy of his acknowledgement. Instead, I focused on positioning. I evaluated what I needed, logistically, financially, legally, to act without panic when the time came. Not to punish him, to protect myself. There's a misconception that decisiveness is loud. In reality, the most consequential decisions often feel anticlimactic. Once made, they simplify everything that follows. I noticed how my internal dialogue changed. There was no more back and forth, no rehearsed conversations, no mental bargaining. The question of what if he explains simply disappeared. Because explanations were no longer the point, I also noticed a subtle emotional shift. The hurt didn't vanish, but it stopped being disorienting. It became one data point among many, not the lens through which everything else was filtered. That steadiness told me I'd chosen correctly. I didn't inform him of this decision. I didn't need to. The decision was about my posture, not his awareness. From that point forward, every interaction was filtered through a different standard. Is this fair? But is this aligned with what I know? And alignment has a way of making choices obvious. I began to prepare, not as a reaction, but as a continuation of the clarity I'd already reached. Each step was small, quiet, practical. There was no countdown, no secret deadline, just a growing sense that the path I was on no longer branched. This wasn't about ending something. It was about refusing to live inside a distortion. The decision point wasn't marked by an event. It was marked by an absence, the absence of doubt. And once doubt leaves, there's nothing left to argue with. Once the decision was made, movement followed naturally, but not visibly. From the outside, life looked unchanged. We still shared meals, still discussing schedules, still existed within the same domestic rhythms. That familiarity wasn't an act. It was simply no longer meaningful in the same way. Inside, however, everything had shifted from emotional to operational. I began with what I could control. I scheduled appointments during lunch breaks. I gathered information without announcing why. I reviewed documents, not out of fear, but out of respect for reality. I wasn't preparing for conflict. I was preparing for independence. There's a particular calm that comes from quiet competence. I'd lived in that space professionally for years, managing systems before they failed, anticipating outcomes before they escalated. Now I applied that same skill set to my personal life. I separated emotion from logistics. Financial clarity came first. I ensured I understood accounts, obligations, and patterns, not to accuse, just to orient myself accurately. I made copies of documents I'd once assumed I'd never need to reference alone. I didn't drain accounts, I didn't hide money, nothing illegal, nothing dramatic, just awareness, readiness. Legally, I educated myself. I learned timelines, processes, and implications. Not because I was rushing toward an ending, but because ignorance creates vulnerability. Knowledge does not. What struck me during this phase was how invisible competence is when it's quiet. No one questioned my movements. No one sensed urgency. I was still the reliable one, the person whose calm was taken for granted. That assumption protected me. Emotionally, I became neutral. Not cold, neutral. I stopped offering reassurance where none was asked. I stopped initiating conversations meant to restore closeness. I also stopped withdrawing in ways that might signal distance. I existed, present, but no longer invested in maintaining illusion. He didn't notice at first, or if he did, he didn't assign it significance. My steadiness had always been the background hum of our relationship. Its altered frequency didn't register immediately. That's the thing about systems. They can be compromised long before they appear unstable. I also reclaimed time, not conspicuously, just small pockets, early mornings, quiet evenings, where I reconnected with myself without explanation. I paid attention to what calmed me, what grounded me, what I'd postponed for the sake of convenience. I wasn't reinventing myself, I was recentering. What surprised me most was the absence of guilt. I'd expected to feel conflicted, maybe even disloyal. Instead, I felt precise, focused, as if I were finally responding proportionately to the situation, rather than emotionally. Moving in silence isn't about secrecy, it's about integrity. I wasn't hiding my actions, I simply wasn't narrating them. I no longer felt obligated to translate my internal process into something digestible for someone else. And because there was no confrontation yet, no one tried to stop me. Days passed, then weeks. The groundwork was laid slowly, carefully, with respect for the weight of what I was preparing for. Not an explosion, but a transition. I understood that when the consequences arrived, they would feel sudden to others, but to me, they would feel like the natural next step in a process that had already been completed internally. That understanding kept me steady. Silence had carried me this far, not as absence, but as intention. And soon, silence would no longer be enough. The first consequence didn't arrive as a confrontation. It arrived in confusion. It showed up in small, almost imperceptible ways. Missed expectations, subtle disruptions, moments where he paused, as if something in the environment had shifted, but he couldn't locate the source. I noticed it before he did. He began asking questions that were framed casually, but carried an edge of uncertainty. "Did we talk about this already? I thought you were handling that. When did you decide this?" I answered plainly, briefly, without the usual cushioning. What he was feeling was the absence of something he'd relied on without realizing it. My anticipatory labor. My habit of smoothing transitions before they became noticeable. My quiet habit of compensating. When that disappeared, the system started to wobble. At first, he attributed it to stress, then to timing, then, briefly, to me being distracted. He didn't accuse. He simply seemed unsettled, as if a familiar surface had lost its traction. I watched this unfold with a surprising amount of detachment, not because I didn't care, but because I understood what was happening. Consequences don't always announce themselves as punishment. Sometimes they arrive as discomfort caused by the removal of an unacknowledged support. He began to feel less certain in conversations. Statements that once landed with confidence were followed by quick glances in my direction, as if checking for confirmation. I didn't offer it. This wasn't retaliation, it was accurate. I responded when asked. I clarified when necessary. But I no longer managed outcomes on his behalf. I allowed things to land where they naturally would. That change altered the emotional temperature of the house. Not dramatically, but enough to be noticed. There was a faint tension now, like static in the air, not conflict, awareness. He started filling the silence with explanations. Stories became longer, more detailed. Justifications appeared where none had been required before. I listened, calmly, without interruption. The more he spoke, the clearer it became that he felt something slipping, but didn't yet know what it was. That's the disorienting part of quiet consequences. When someone loses an advantage they never realized they had, they don't experience it as a loss at first. They experience it as instability. I also noticed how others reacted. Friends commented that I seemed different. Not unhappy, just harder to read, less available, less immediately responsive. They meant it neutrally, but the observation confirmed what I already knew. My emotional accessibility had been part of my social currency. Now that I wasn't offering it freely, people felt the shift. I didn't explain myself. I didn't need to. Inside I felt steady, not vindicated, not satisfied, just aligned. This phase required restraint. It would have been easy to point out the changes, to say, this is what happens when I stop compensating. But that would have turned the process into an argument, and arguments invite denial. I wasn't interested in being right. I was interested in being done with distortion. As the days passed, the discomfort sharpened. He asked directly one evening, "Is something wrong?" I looked at him and said, "I'm paying attention." It wasn't an accusation. It wasn't an invitation. It was a statement. He didn't know how to respond to that. That moment marked the beginning of something irreversible. Not because of what I said, but because of what I no longer did. I didn't reassure him. I didn't soften the implication. I let the ambiguity remain. The consequences were no longer abstract. They had entered the relational space. And once they do, there's no returning to the previous equilibrium. By the time he realized something was truly wrong, the window for repair had already closed. Not because I was unwilling to talk, but because the kind of conversation required to fix it would have needed to happen months earlier, when I was still asking questions instead of gathering answers. The first sign of panic was subtle. He began checking in more often, asking how I was feeling, offering small gestures of attention that would have mattered once. They landed now as delayed responses. I accepted them politely, without warmth, without rejection, just acknowledgement. That neutrality confused him more than anger would have. He started bringing up the past, selective memories framed as evidence of our strength. We've always been good at working through things. We've handled worse than this. The language was familiar. It assumed continuity. I listened without correcting him, because continuity was exactly what no longer existed. At some point, he tried reassurance. He spoke about commitment, about how stressed he'd been, about how I'd misread certain things. That's when I knew it was too late. Not because the words were wrong, but because they followed a pattern I could now see clearly. They were designed to restore equilibrium without addressing distortion, to return us to a version of reality where my doubt was the problem and his behavior was contextual. I didn't argue. I didn't counter with evidence. I didn't expose what I knew. I simply stopped participating in the narrative. That withdrawal unsettled him. He began oscillating between concern and frustration. One moment gentle, the next defensive. He couldn't locate the lever that used to recalibrate me. That's when regret appeared, not as accountability, but as urgency. He wanted resolution. I wanted coherence. Those two desires are not the same. I understood then that repair wasn't impossible. It was irrelevant. Repair would have required him to sit with discomfort without rushing to erase it, to acknowledge not just what he'd done, but how he'd trained me to doubt myself. And that kind of reckoning can't be rushed into once consequences are already in motion. He asked me directly if I was unhappy. I told him the truth. I'm no longer confused. He didn't understand that answer, and he wasn't meant to. Clarity looks like coldness to someone accustomed to control through explanation. The atmosphere in the house changed. Not volatile, quietly strained. He sensed that whatever was happening didn't have a quick fix, that no single conversation would reset the tone. That realization frightened him. He tried to reinsert intimacy, to reestablish routines, to remind me of who we'd been, but who we'd been depended on my silence being unexamined. Now that silence was intentional, and it no longer served him. There's a particular sadness in watching someone realize too late that they misjudged your capacity for departure. Not because you wanted to leave, but because they assumed you never would. I didn't take satisfaction in that moment. I took responsibility. Responsibility for my own clarity, for the steps I'd already taken, for the decision not to be pulled back into confusion for the sake of comfort. By the time he was ready to listen differently, I no longer needed to speak. And that's when repair becomes impossible. Not because the damage is too great, but because the person who was willing to absorb it has changed. The conversation happened on a weekday evening. No build-up, no dramatic timing, just a quiet moment when avoidance was no longer sustainable. He asked if we could talk. I said yes. We sat at the dining table, the same place where so many neutral conversations had taken place. The familiarity of the setting stripped the moment of spectacle. There would be no raised voices here, no emotional surge to hide behind. He spoke first. He said he felt distance, that he didn't know where he stood, that he wanted to understand what was happening. I listened, fully, without interruption. When he finished, he looked at me the way someone looks when they're waiting for a reaction they know how to manage. What I offered instead was clarity. I told him I knew about the other woman. I didn't name dates. I didn't cite messages. I didn't present evidence. I didn't accuse. I stated it as fact. The effect was immediate, not explosive, but destabilizing. His posture changed. His breathing shifted. He tried to respond quickly, then stopped himself. He asked how long I'd known. I said, long enough. He began explaining. I let him speak. This was the first time I noticed how much energy explanation requires when it's not grounded in truth. The words came fast, layered with context, justification, and careful omissions. When he finished, he waited. I told him something I'd rehearsed only once, silently. I'm not interested in debating my perception anymore. That sentence changed the dynamic. He tried to reassure me, to emphasize what the relationship still meant, to suggest counseling, repair, time. I didn't reject those ideas emotionally. I rejected them structurally. I told him that the affair wasn't the only issue, that what mattered just as much was how often I'd been told, explicitly and implicitly, that my concerns were overreactions. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't list grievances. I didn't dramatize the pain. I explained the pattern. And for the first time, he couldn't reframe it. Because patterns don't argue back. They just exist. He was quiet then. I told him I had already made decisions about what I needed next. That this conversation wasn't about asking permission or seeking agreement. It was about informing him. He asked if there was any way to change my mind. I answered honestly, no. There was no anger in my voice, no triumph, just finality. Finality doesn't require force. It requires alignment. He looked at me for a long moment. I saw regret there, but also confusion. Not about the situation, but about me. He had misjudged the depth of my stillness, assumed it was endurance. I stood up when the conversation ended, not abruptly, just when there was nothing left to say. As I walked away, I felt something unexpected, relief, not because the truth was out, but because I had spoken without heat, without needing him to understand, in order for my words to stand. The confrontation didn't change him. It changed the narrative, and that was enough. I'm often asked, carefully, indirectly, how I feel now. The question usually comes with an expectation that I'll describe anger or grief or bitterness disguised as wisdom. That I'll frame the aftermath as something I survived, rather than something I integrated. The truth is quieter. Who I am now isn't defined by what I endured. It's defined by what I no longer tolerate. internally or externally. I didn't emerge from this experience hardened. I emerged clarified. For a long time, I believed strength meant flexibility. That being emotionally capable meant being able to absorb discomfort without making it visible. I mistook my capacity to endure for an obligation to do so. Now I understand the difference. I still listen. I still consider context. I still value nuance, but I no longer override my internal signals in order to preserve someone else's comfort. I no longer negotiate with denial. What changed wasn't my temperament, it was my allegiance. I stopped being loyal to the version of myself that existed to maintain equilibrium at any cost. That shift didn't make me louder. It made me more precise. I'm more deliberate with my time now, more selective with my energy. I notice when something doesn't align, and I don't rush to explain it away. I let the information settle before deciding what it requires of me. There's no constant vigilance, no guardedness, just awareness. I've also learned that composure can be misunderstood. That people may assume you're calm means you're unaffected, or that you'll always be there to stabilize things. I no longer correct that assumption. I don't perform closure. I don't narrate healing. I live it quietly. When I look back at the woman I was, I don't judge her. She did what she knew how to do with the information she had. She valued harmony because she believed it was evidence of love. Now I value coherence. I understand that emotional justice doesn't require punishment. It requires alignment between what you know and how you live. There's no bitterness here. Bitterness would imply I'm still oriented around the injury. I'm not. I'm oriented around myself. I don't need to tell my story often. I don't need validation for it. But when I do share it, it's because I recognize something familiar in someone else. The quiet doubt, the self-questioning, the feeling of being too sensitive in environments that benefit from your restraint. If there's one thing I carry forward, it's this. Clarity is not cruelty, and silence, when chosen, is not weakness. I'm still calm, still observant, still capable of deep care. The difference is that I no longer disappear inside those qualities. I take up the space my perception requires and no more than that. And that has been enough. There's a temptation, at the end of stories like this, to offer a lesson wrapped in certainty, to tell you what to do. If you ever find yourself where I was, I won't do that. Because what I learned didn't arrive as advice. It arrived as recognition. For a long time, I thought the greatest harm in my marriage was the affair itself. The secrecy, the betrayal, the knowledge that something intimate had been shared elsewhere. And yes, that pain was real. But it wasn't the deepest wound. The deeper wound was being slowly trained to doubt my own perception and calling that love. Being told in small, reasonable ways that my reactions were excessive, my questions unnecessary, my discomfort inconvenient. Being taught that if I were calmer, quieter, and more understanding, the confusion would disappear. It didn't. Gaslighting hurts more than the truth, because truth, even when painful, gives you ground to stand on. Gaslighting erodes that ground. It turns your inner life into something provisional, something that needs approval before it's allowed to exist. What ultimately ended my marriage wasn't one discovery. It was the moment I stopped bargaining with my own awareness. I didn't leave because I was angry. I left because I was clear. And clarity is a quiet thing. It doesn't shout. It doesn't threaten. It doesn't need witnesses to be real. If there's a moral here, it isn't about leaving. It's about listening, especially when the voice you're tempted to dismiss is your own. Pay attention to how often you're asked to be reasonable at the expense of being honest. Notice whether peace in your life depends on your silence. Ask yourself who benefits when you explain things away before they're even questioned. You don't need dramatic proof to trust your intuition. You don't need permission to take your discomfort seriously. And you don't need to justify your clarity to someone who depended on your confusion. Quiet dominance isn't about control over others. It's about sovereignty over yourself. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is stop trying to be understood by someone committed to misunderstanding you, and start living in alignment with what you already know. I'm not sharing this story to offer closure for you. I'm sharing it to create space. So I'll leave you with one question, one that doesn't demand an answer, but invites honesty. Have you ever stayed silent not because you didn't know the truth, but because speaking it would have required you to change your life? If that question resonates, you're not alone. And if you feel comfortable, I'd like to hear your thoughts in the comments. Sometimes, naming the quiet truths is how we begin to reclaim them,